Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Waku, and I'm an AI YouTuber. I try to explain to people how AI will impact them in the future.
Yeah, have you ever thought deeply about what it would be like to have, like, to be an octopus? Like, as the distributed brain through the different tentacles?
I've not thought about it, but yes, your brain is like split up and you're a distributed system and your arms can think on their own. I think that's the main thing I've seen where you have fiction about intelligent octopi, as they say, like the the arms just kind of figure stuff out. So the same way we have muscle memory, like I don't know exactly how to what my password is, but when I sit down and I just type, I type my password. Um, so you can imagine the same thing, except you're just like, I don't really know how to make a sandwich, but my arms just know how to make a sandwich. Or I don't really know how to, I don't know, write a program from scratch, but my arms know how to do that, right? You just delegate even more to the muscle memory.
And do you think you'd kind of have to wait or encourage it? Like, if you wanted to make a sandwich, but you had a brain in your hand that had learned that skill, not in your head that was connected. So do you think you'd probably put the bread out on the table and then put your hand near it and then kind of hope for the best?
You'd probably just envision a past instance where you made a sandwich, right? Because these brains are talking to each other in the same way that AI agents would be talking to each other and exchanging requests. And unless your hand brain is on bad terms with your head brain, when the head brain's like, "Hey, I'm thinking about sandwiches," then the hand brain's like, "Okay, sure, and we'll do that." Um, but if you just recently burned your hand because your head was like, "I've got to put my hand there," and you got pain as a result, maybe it might be hard to make a sandwich. Try again in 15 minutes.
Like, you have to negotiate all these things with your body parts to
That's right.
try to get them to work together because they'll have their own goals.
That's
Like,
right.
oh. Yeah, and I read an article a little while ago about what it might feel like to be a rat that's remotely controlled. So I think we can do it with cockroaches, and there's some ways that you can stimulate mice, rats to turn in a certain direction or to move in a certain direction. And do you have any thoughts on, like, if when the rat is instructed because a human put an electrical wire in their brain and told them to turn right, do you think the rat is surprised they turned right and they have like this disjointed consciousness, or do you think they just kind of naturally just wrap that all up and sort of confabulate their thoughts to make everything work smoothly and think they've made that decision?
So there's a very interesting aspect of mechanistic interpretability again, which is that sometimes you can take the output of a neural network and then you can try to come up with a plausible explanation for why you turned right. So if you are trying to figure out this in a neural network sense, you would go, well, to the right, it smells like food, so that's why I turned right. Even though that didn't happen at all, right? Actually, someone messed with the neural network in the middle and generated a turn right signal. So I think that rats would be similar, and even humans are similar too. You know that for a lot of spatial movement stuff, our body has to react faster than we can consciously think. So you'll see things like people start moving, fractions of a second, say 100 milliseconds, before they've consciously decided to do so. Because when you have a conscious thought, what's actually happening is your brain is doing a really complicated search through a really big search space, right, of all the different things that you might be thinking about. And it actually takes some time to settle on any given thought. It's around 60 milliseconds, I think. I don't remember the exact number, but basically, like, your thoughts are highly non-deterministic, right? You might be distracted, go down a different train of thought. You might continue thinking about the thing you were thinking about. You might get a sensory input that interrupts it halfway, and then you start thinking, "Oh, I'm hungry. That smells delicious." Whatever. There's a lot of different things that can happen, and because of the complexity of that search space, it takes a while before the biological brain actually settles in on a thought. So what's happening here is, like, let's say that the thought is like, "Oh, I'm about to fall. This isn't good." Right? As it's kind of settling in on that thought, the rest of the brain that actually responds to danger can start picking up on that and go, "Oh, it looks like I'm about to think that something dangerous is about to happen," and it can trigger the neural reflexes to automatically start, like, catching yourself on your hands or like moving away from something hot or whatever the reaction is, right? Or it may not even involve your conscious processing part of your brain at all, and it's more like the octopus's hand, right? You touch it, and now there's an immense pain signal that comes. You touch something hot, there's an immense pain signal that comes up your arm, and that just gets wired directly into the motor control part of your brain, and it has an instinctive reaction to just move away from anything that's really hot. So yeah, we do this all the time. We act physically several milliseconds or even tens of milliseconds before we have consciously decided to do so. So let's say your body acts by turning right. I'm pretty sure the same thing would happen, right? You would go, you would think, oh, that was my body's instinctive reaction. And then you would make up a story for why this was the case.
So it's almost maybe about how fast the decision was made. I guess if it was slow, then your brain might need to comprehend why like this long decision was made. Like, I don't know if you could stimulate the brain in a way that said like, now you're going to take a new career path. And then the brain might be like, no, that's not the career path I want to go on. But then it has to come to some complicated conclusion about why that's a decision versus some instinct the body did, which the brain's already naturally good at kind of covering up or making an excuse for.
Our brains are actually very good at noticing inconsistencies in things. So if we observe two things that seem to contradict each other, we worry about that a lot and we try to figure out why. And it's actually a survival instinct too, because if you have someone who's trying to deceive you, or you have some people that are conspiring against you, what will probably happen is there's some mismatch between their behavior and what they're saying.
What are the odds that AI will solve the mystery of human consciousness in the next 30 years?
The mystery of human consciousness. You mean you want to know exactly what goes on inside our heads and how we are and how we feel. It seems like consciousness is actually just a natural emergent property. I haven't done a ton of research into this, but it seems like to me that animals have, that like higher animals that are most closely related to humans have some amount of consciousness, and it affects their behaviors, it affects their families and their relationships. And humans have just been down that evolutionary track a little bit further. So the interesting question to me is not, will we discover what makes something conscious? Because I think it's just an emergent property. To me, it'll be, will we create machines that also exhibit consciousness to our level of understanding? Like, do they say they're conscious? Do they act as if they're conscious? Because it's very hard to pin down exactly what consciousness means.
And does your instinct give you the sense that you have to be attached to like a three-dimensional body, or maybe even hormones would have to play a role?
It's a good question. So it's like, does an AI have to be embodied to really be conscious, or does an entity have to be embodied to be conscious? I think that AIs have become a lot better at a lot of the reasoning and thinking and knowledge processing capabilities of a human. I realize that a lot of the things that humans seem to take for granted, which are like being able to walk around a space and not crash into things, or being able to judge how to throw a ball and hit the target, all the physical movement and spatial capabilities and reasoning, that's such a huge part of who we are. And so when we look at an AI and we see that it can't do any of those things because it's not embodied and it doesn't have those spatial reasoning, we think, how can this really be conscious? How can this really be like us? So that's one way that you could have consciousness arise, right? Is having to deal with and be in a very physically complicated space. But I don't see why it would be necessary. It's, if an AI can develop, if an AI can interact with equally complicated things in the digital realm, it seems pretty equivalent to me.
So do you see the different AI agents in the future, even if they all seem like they're trained differently and kind of communicating differently, coming into a whole mechanism with like its own kind of guided direction, like a society?
You have to have really high bandwidth with something to feel like it is part of the same entity. So in a human brain, there's actually a lot of connections between the left and the right hemisphere. And without those connections, we can't really function. So similarly, I think we all have pretty high bandwidth connections with our phones, with our smartphones. We look at them a lot. They give us pictures. We give them voice data. There's a lot of going back and forth there, which is why we feel like they're part of ourselves. And this is actually a psychological fact, right? Like, if you don't believe it, try swapping phones with the person next to you while you're sitting at a theater and see how long you can sit there uncomfortable before you demand your phone back. So if the bandwidth is high enough and the agents share some commonality or share some goals, then I think that they would probably start to feel like they're extensions of each other, in the same way that we feel like our phone is sort of an extension of us. You know, it's not like the phone can do anything I can do and vice versa, but like, if I'm trying to get something done, I'll use my phone to call people and email people, and my phone will tell me where to go, and then I'll go there and argue and ask for things and buy things and whatever is necessary to get something done. So in the same way, if agents share the same input source, or they're tasked in the same domain, or they run into each other, they bump into each other a lot, they would probably start to feel like there's a community. Like you can depend on your friend, you can depend on your phone, you divide up a task, you do some, I do some. I have a mental model of you, so I know what you like and your preferences, and I can anticipate those and, you know, generally act in a way that will make you more comfortable and make us feel connected. But if you imagine how AIs will interact in the future, there'll be a lot of stuff going back and forth. They'll invent their own protocols. It might be based on things that we know, like JSON and, you know, uh, JSON or RPC calls
Oh.
or straightforward stuff.
But they might even invent a new way to communicate.
They
Something
almost certainly
better.
will. They almost certainly will because once you are communicating in really high volume, it makes sense to make a dictionary that defines commonly used phrases and then substitute that in, and now you have twice the bandwidth and just repeat. It's the same way that like if you work closely with somebody, say a coworker, then you guys might make up technical terms for what you're doing, and you say, "Oh, this is a crash and burn" to refer to some client case, right? And now you know what that means because you have seen a lot of crash and burn cases in the past, and that short form lets you communicate more rapidly. So this would absolutely happen between AI systems. So you might get like the Microsoft AI chatting to some Google AI, and eventually humans may not really know everything that they're communicating about. So they're going to they're going to remain separate in the sense that they'll run on different infrastructure, but they could well be like delegating small tasks to each other and, you know, establishing that sense of community and establishing more and more um, shared vocabulary and shared words to the point where, yeah, it's kind of more like a hive mind, right, with different regions than really separate entities.
Do you think we will figure out the black box scenario, at least up until they're hyper intelligent, and have a good chance of kind of understanding that and then hopefully using that for alignment?
Yeah, that's the biggest goal of the research area called mechanistic interpretability, which is to really understand what's happening inside a neural network, which is pretty close to understanding the AI's thoughts. There's some ways in which we can already understand an AI's thoughts, like when you have a chain of thought reasoning inside a model, you're getting it to explicitly output English before using that as the input to the next stage, and so you can see this sequence of English thoughts that it's gone through. Um, but there's reason to believe that more complicated chains of thought, the model will make up its own symbolic language internally, the same sort of way that we're talking about how two AIs talking to each other would make up their own language. And then even within one neural network, right now, we don't have much visibility into what it's doing. There's lots of interpretability techniques that are trying to do that, but we don't really know. So it seems like a very hard problem to make progress on to me, to be honest. You can instead build an AI from the ground up with interpretability built in, and there are groups that are trying that, but it's hard to scale those to the level at which we have current LLM technology. So I think for a while at least, it's going to be pretty opaque exactly what the LLMs are thinking, because even once you have this chain of thought, that's going to become more opaque. The neural networks themselves are going to become more opaque rather than less opaque because they're going to get more complicated. And probably at some point, someone will say, we really need to understand what these models are thinking. And they'll make a system from the ground up with that in mind, or they'll be willing to take like severe performance penalties so they can really understand what's happening. But right now, it doesn't seem to be a top of the line goal.
Yeah, yeah, so interesting. And then of course we'll probably figure out how our brains work at that same point, and then we won't be at the same mystery we are.
Well, it would be fun to understand how our brains work because not everyone has an internal monologue, right? And not everyone thinks verbally. A lot of people think visually instead, or as you said as well, people that have had brain trauma or brain injuries, they end up like with synesthesia, for example, like linking different senses together in a way that doesn't really make sense. Like if they see the color yellow, they smell something at the same time or whatever. So it's really fascinating how we all think.
So now let's talk about aliens and why we don't actually see them when we look up at the sky. So Fermi paradox and the Great Filter are a couple of topics you know a lot about. Can you kind of expand on some of your thoughts?
I mean, the Great Filter theory is basically that there are lots of hard steps in evolution that we had to pass through in order to become an intelligent species. So the number of hard steps is a really important question. If there's a lot of hard steps, then we got extremely lucky, which could explain why there are no other intelligent species that we can currently detect. Or maybe there might just be a few hard steps. And then that makes it more mysterious why we can't really see any alien life out there. Actually, statistically, we're really early in the history of the universe because basically white dwarf stars can live for like 100 billion years or something like that. So we're only like 1% or 0.1% of the way through the lifetime of the universe during which life could reasonably evolve. So that's assuming that that's assuming that life can actually evolve over white dwarf stars, because our star is not, it's a yellow star. But still, it's a reasonable hypothesis. So if we're so early to be in the first percent or the first 0.1%, then why is that? And it could just be an anomaly. But if we are statistically closer to the midpoint, closer to the norm, then that means that in the future, all of those planets on all of those stars are unavailable for life to evolve, which is really weird when you think about it. But one possible explanation is that those planets are actually all taken by some alien civilizations as they expand, or even us as we expand. Because once the planet is used by a civilization, then it can't really evolve native life of its own, right? So that's basically the grabby aliens theory. And to complete the picture, if you do the math and you assume that we are sort of statistically normal, then you would end up with tons of civilizations, even in our Milky Way galaxy right now, that are expanding towards us at near the speed of light and gobbling up or grabbing all of the free planetary real estate that they find along the way. Weird theory, but one that I found pretty interesting when I was doing research on the Fermi paradox in the past.
Well, I was going to say, so is your sense that we're in front of it or behind it at this point?
My sense is that we have not passed through the great filter, that there are still other steps along the way that we would have to pass through to become a civilization that really lasts for the long term. And I say that because I feel like we have weapons that we don't fully know how to control that could easily destroy our civilization, right? Nukes are one, maybe super advanced AI is another. So to be a fully secure civilization that's past the great filter, you would want to be multi-planet probably, because there's just so many dangers that can happen if you're on a single planet. But even when you're multi-planet, you have the problem that it's really easy to destroy a planet from afar. You can just throw some kinetic object at it, like just an asteroid that's accelerated to really high velocity, and that will do a lot of damage to a planet or even a star. So even then, you have this difficult balance of power where there are offensive weapons, like accelerating an object to near the speed of light, which you can't really easily counter unless you have a lot of control over gravity or something. So in that scenario, even a multi-planetary species may not really be fully stable. It may not be past the great filter. It might be great filters all the way along, right? And looking back more into our history, we know that there's probably been several really hard steps of evolution along the way, including the jump from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms. Single-celled organisms, of course, evolved like 4 billion years ago, long time ago. And then during this period between 1.4 billion years ago and about 400 million years ago, so that's a period of 1 billion years, during that time, nothing much seemed to happen. There were single-celled organisms on Earth, and sometime during that period, multi-celled organisms arose, but they didn't immediately rise to dominance. You know, they just kind of existed in the ocean because all the life was pretty much in the ocean at that time. Scientists for a long time called this the boring billion because life didn't really seem to evolve at all. But recently, there's been fossil evidence of some pretty large single-celled organisms that were probably apex predators during that time. In other words, they would eat everything else. They would eat anything they came across. And it's quite likely that the multi-celled organisms that did evolve had to really keep their heads down, so to speak, to avoid getting eaten. They were near the bottom of the food chain. So that's what prevented them from evolving further, was the presence of these like apex predators that were single-celled organisms. Then 400 million years ago, there's some catastrophe and lots of species die out, including these apex predators. And that's the point where we see multi-celled organisms really start to kick off and start to dominate life on Earth. So essentially, the jump from single celled to multi-celled could be considered a hard step because we almost didn't pass through it. If that extinction event didn't happen, we could still be having a soup of single-celled organisms and a few multi-celled sprinkled in. The boring billion could be a boring 10 billion, and then we just don't evolve. So to me, that's pretty good evidence that at least that one step is very hard, and there are plenty of other candidates for very hard steps along the way.
Yeah, so I'm super fascinated with how, yeah, depending on how the story of life evolved on other planets, that would shape the way that they maybe came to their understanding of intelligence, the way they maybe first started to discover math and physics, and start to eventually maybe create this moment where we're kind of on the cusp of AGI or ASI. And then they would have been aligning it to whatever their values were. So if the intelligent species on the planet wasn't humans now at the top of the food chain, but we were still under maybe a long evolutionary history of being stealth or secretive to survive, like a chameleon or something, then maybe we would have aligned AI that way too. So then when we became multiplanetary, we would now be in a bigger pool of potential other aliens to compete with, and some might try stealth, some might try aggression, some might try peace, some might have kind of different mechanisms. And then have you thought about like if stealth would be the right route for us, or like what you're kind of hoping that we end up if we do get into multi-species or multi-planet species?
As a species, we've only been emitting radio waves for 100 years or so, right? And that information has only traveled 100 light years from us. And so it's very plausible that we would stop emitting radio waves at some point in the near future, either because our technology is advanced and we no longer need to broadcast things into the atmosphere and we can just use fiber optics or something, or because we get wiped out, right? So if you're trying to spot another civilization, you probably have these very short time windows, and if you miss it, then it's gone, So there's a theory called the dark forest theory, which says that maybe the reason we don't see much life out there is because it's all really stealthy, to your example, right? And the reason that might happen is, for example, maybe there are a lot of offensive weapons like relativistic asteroids that mean that being noisy is a bad evolutionary strategy in intergalactic terms. So if that's the case, well, we've started out being pretty noisy. We haven't been noisy for that long, just like 100 years or something. So I don't know if we would actually continue that strategy as we continue to evolve. Seems to me quite likely that the more aggressive species that are willing to broadcast their radio waves and so on would run into other pretty aggressive species that are also willing to broadcast their radio waves or be open about their transformation of the solar system, building Dyson spheres or things like that are pretty obvious from far away. So I think there's reason to believe that, yeah, humanity might decide to really kind of quiet down, just hang out in our neck of the woods and not really try to expand too far, too fast, or too noisily.
Okay, what about going the kind of other route, like where we really stop expanding and go maybe more internal? So I want to ask you about AI, human hybrid, kind of BCI, brain computer interface type future for us. Like, what do you think about the idea that the best life isn't staying embodied, but it might be digitalizing our consciousness and sort of letting go of the body or severely augmenting it until we're barely just the kind of creatures we are today?
I really like this theory because to me, it's one of the best ways for humans and AIs or advanced digital entities to coexist, because we are on different time scales, first of all. Like, to a human, AIs think and move and act so incredibly quickly that there can be no equality. But if the humans actually start getting implants so that they can think faster or access databases and information similar to how an AI can do it, then you can imagine us all kind of evolving on as a species and as a kind of hybrid civilization. I think that one of the big problems with outer space is that it's so big. If you go and colonize another planet, you can't have anything close to real-time communications assuming you can't get faster than light communication. But that's another whole can of worms. Space is so big that you can't meaningfully like have these kinds of collaborations, interactions, and you essentially end up as another species or another civilization. And that again increases the chance of conflict between you and this other planet that you've settled, because you end up doing a bunch of stuff for a year that the other planet doesn't know anything about. So I can see a lot of arguments for staying within the local solar system and therefore expanding into the digital space instead, because you have to like expand somewhere when you're thinking about what's your future going to look like. The nice thing about expanding into the digital space instead of physical is, again, you have instantaneous travel. You can create resources whenever you need them, assuming it's pretty cheap to create computation in the real universe, for example. And even if it's not cheap to create computation, you can just slow down the clock rate of your entire civilization. That gives you more resources to play with. You can have more people alive if everybody's running at 80% CPU capacity, so to speak. So there's a ton of flexibility when it comes to digital realms.
Oh yeah, I never thought about that. Yeah, well, just it's interesting thought that usually I just think of population, but all population also by default just goes at the time of human biology. But I guess yeah, in a future where people have different clock speeds, it's not just about how many of them we have taking up resources, it's about how fast they're running. So maybe like Elon Musk could afford his BCI agent to consume a lot more resources and essentially be like hundreds of thousands of years ahead of us in thinking.
Yeah, in a sense, maybe resources become even more important because you can kind of scale your consciousness up, or you can scale your resources up to take whatever is available. But at the same time, the civilizational constraints don't really matter as much, right? Like running out of water equivalent. That probably doesn't happen because if needed, then everybody slows themselves down kind of thing, right? And now what have you lost, right? Nothing really.
Do you think that you're going to have your own 200th birthday? Do you see AI figuring out our biology and the world that we live in right now coming up with the solutions to kind of biological aging, minus the accidental things that can always happen? But do you think maybe a natural progression of age is coming to an end?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And if you think about it from the AI perspective, then you start imagining a transition from regular drugs and treatments and analyses that have to work across a population of people, like everybody, or everybody of a similar age group and so on, and moving into personalized medicine, for example, where they try to look at what's happening really in your body, and then they try to give you the medicine that's most appropriate for that. And moving beyond that to something like a full body simulation of yourself so that you know exactly what will happen if you take this medication or you do this intervention. So, and they're actually starting to do already very accurate simulations of parts of the human body when they're doing drug trials and drug testing. But full body simulation is still, very complicated and far away from what we can do. But the point at which you can do full body simulation of a human, and I'm just talking the molecules, right? Like not simulation necessarily of what you're thinking or anything like that, just like what chemically is going to happen, what are the interactions biologically and chemically when you take this drug or you start on this diet regimen or exercise regimen or whatever it is. When you have that, it seems to me like you'd be able to debug, diagnose, figure out a lot of issues that are completely invisible to us right now with our bodies, right? Especially if you have monitoring of your own body to see how closely it matches a simulation, for example. If you have a couple nanobots or a few scanners that are looking at your own body, and then a supercomputer that can emulate it and say, hey, if you keep eating this, there's a 25% chance you develop lung cancer or something. Then I think that's going to make a lot of us much healthier. But does it really solve the aging problem? I mean, the aging problem is very complicated because you have this extremely sophisticated biological system, and over time, entropy starts to wear and tear at different pieces of it. It's not like you just go and you like fix the telomeres and then everything is good. I mean, that helps, but you have to think of all the different ways that cells can break down and stop working. And
it's very complex.
It's very complex. It's like going from a working computer to a broken computer, right? Like what could have broken? Well, like literally anything could have broken. How do you fix it?
Right.
So I don't think that we'll really be able to solve aging completely, because to do so is basically like saying we will be able to figure out all the possible permutations of what can happen in a biological being. Right? There's got to be cases that are just beyond the capacity of the AI or the human and AI doctors to figure out. But it does seem likely to me that with a full body simulation, you'd be able to tackle most of the common causes of aging. The same way that right now we can offer medication for many of the most common diseases, right? But if you catch some genetic thing or something for which we don't know any treatment, then you're kind of out of luck. I see the future as being very similar to that. But yeah, for the average person, quite likely that you'd be able to solve aging to the extent possible until they are 150 or 200 years old, and then they develop some genetic anomaly or something like that that's really hard to fix.
So what percentage would you tag for your estimate for your own life having a 200th birthday?
Well, I actually have an autoimmune condition, so my hands are very sore from typing. I can't really type on a computer keyboard very much. So I use voice recognition on this microphone over here to interact with my computer for the most part. So I managed to finish my PhD program, but I kind of dropped out of the academic stream and had to do other work, other jobs instead. Um, it's an autoimmune condition, which means it's your body attacking itself. It's not a very severe one in my case. Most of my symptoms, like with pain from typing and stuff and having to wear these gloves, most of my symptoms come from fibromyalgia, which is basically your brain getting really confused and interpreting signals down your nerves as painful, even when they're not painful. So it knows there's something wrong, right? Your immune system's attacking yourself, so it tries to like amp up the sensitivity to figure out like, what's really happening. Can we attack this? Can we attack that? What can we do to solve this? But the tools your body has to solve things are part of the problem, right? Luckily for me, it's a condition that's probably going to be stable for quite a long time. So if the AIs do get around to thinking about that problem, I'll probably still be around to trial it or whatever. But one of the proposals I've seen is for human immune systems to be completely replaced with synthetic immune systems. If you have nanobots, there's some reason to believe that you could build something that's more effective because it could be centrally controlled. You could kind of broadcast from one part of your body to everywhere else, saying like, "Hey, this is a new pathogen. Download the schematics," something like that. So that's a pretty extreme case, but I could imagine, for example, replacing my immune system with a synthetic one might actually solve my issue, right? So it's not like I would necessarily have to get a solution to my specific thing, but rather, advancements in medical tech might make it possible through other means. So I don't really know what kind of label or percentage to put on it. I just hope I'm still around to see a lot of this and to report on it and to think about it deeply because I really enjoy doing that.
Oh yeah, I hope so too.
Yeah.
Yeah, best of luck with that. I mean, definitely it seems like when you talked about how fast AGI was coming and all of those things, there will be a lot of things solved. There'll be a lot of breakthroughs. I mean, one of the things I'm excited about with my YouTube channel is just to cover this rapidly changing world. I mean, there's going to be the news writes itself every single day. There's always research papers. It's not a very stagnant industry. So certainly there's hope out there for every immune disorder. So
exactly.
What do you think about 3D printed meat? Are you interested in putting stem cells into some kind of a 3D printer and then maybe trying to eliminate some of the factory farming and carbon problems that we have with the meat process?
I'm biased. I'm vegetarian, have been since birth. And so for me, the fact that it takes like 100 times as much water, for example, to produce some beef as compared with some vegetable, means that you have a huge resource impact, even just from water, leaving aside the like ethical considerations and and everything else. It's hard to be vegetarian. You have to think a lot more about nutrition. But for me, it's worth it. And as for synthetic meat, yeah, I mean, I have things like, soy burgers and stuff like that. I don't like it if it is designed to taste like meat. But just because it's not familiar to me, my body's like, is this really familiar?
Yeah, you've had a whole lifetime of eating vegetables. Yeah, I could see that.
But I do think it's a really good idea because meat consumption is like one of the biggest one of the biggest polluters out there, right? Even just the methane from cows farting all the time is like a giant slice of the pie in terms of global pollution. I know that people will have to adapt, right? Like it probably doesn't taste exactly the same. It's probably even like psychologically, you're eating something synthetic, right? Um, but yeah, I mean, some people will be willing to, some people won't, and hopefully the society over time will move towards. I think it was Ursula K. Le Guin that said, um, in the future we will be abhor. We will find eating real meat abhorrent. Like we will evolve past that point, and I don't know if she was vegetarian or not, but that was her perspective, and I think it's quite true, right? Like society changes quite rapidly these days. Like you go from something being socially unacceptable to being like okay in a few places, and then almost fully and universally accepted in like 5 years, 10 years now. So I think it's quite likely that we might transition there, but just a vegetarian's perspective.
Yeah, it's always interesting because, like, if I had to actually be part of the entire cycle that brings the food to my plate, I would eat maybe no meat or very little because to see what the chickens are going through, to see the farm factory situations, or for me to actually go you put the energy into hunt something and then cut it and cook it, it would just not really be worth it, in a lot of cases. And there's just skills I haven't ever developed. So yeah, I'm kind of toying around with very drastically minimizing the meat in my diet. It's maybe a step away from vegetarian, but I'm interested in becoming more like the way you are.
And if you think about it, the reason we eat so much meat is because in the past it was a delicacy, right? If you have trouble getting enough food to feed yourself, meat has a lot more protein, it has a lot more nutrients in it. And so, you know, in like less than a few hundred years ago, it was only royalty, like kings and queens, that could afford to eat meat on a regular basis. And there's still people alive today that can't afford to eat meat on a regular basis. So it kind of became ingrained in us as like a luxury or like a desirable thing to be able to eat meat all the time, right? And now people in developed countries can eat it all the time if they want to, and biologically they've kind of evolved to believe that that is good, right? You get endorphins from that sort of thing. So um, I do think it takes a lot of willpower to move away from that, especially if you actually like meat and have eaten it all your life, right? It's kind of a big step. Um, and it's kind of going against our evolution in a way. But I think it's necessary that more people do that because we have to reduce our footprint somehow.
Let's switch subjects to the like post-scarcity economy. Like if we do take the assumption that AI starts to solve like pretty much every serious problem, we might have self-driving cars. They can get us around for pennies based on free market principles, and for the most part clothing can be driven down to Amazon prices that are extremely cheap. And it doesn't feel like the world has the same sense of we can employ everybody to do work because robots do so much. Maybe UBI is on the table, maybe not. How do you see us like transitioning into a like post-scarcity economy?
Post-scarcity means more time to do what you want to do. If you think about now, most people in the world, I think, trade 5 days of work for 2 days of doing what they want. If you have a 9 to 5 job, and if you're wealthy or close to retiring or lucky in some other ways, then maybe you trade 2 days for 5 days back, or 1 day for 6 days back. And I think that would be the natural transition. You wouldn't have like some portion of the population working all the time where a bunch of other people are just lazing about. I think everybody's work would slowly decrease on average so that you start getting more of your time back. So what would that be like? I mean, it's sort of like having a vacation or sort of like having time to pursue what you really want to do. I think almost everybody would find it immensely beneficial.
Well, presumably at first they wouldn't have money. They would say, I wish I could work 5 days a week and trade my labor, but it doesn't seem like there's a job willing to pay me, and I have kids and family. Where do you think the government's role should be, or big tech's role in that? Or is this just free market? People need to figure out how to code and provide a value as quickly as possible?
Well, you're talking to a Canadian, so I'm
Okay.
going to have a different answer than other
Yeah,
people might.
that's fine.
Um,
I'm curious.
I think, yeah, so you want to know more about the transition period. I mean, I think the transition period would be really, really messy, right? Because the portion of society that still has jobs would say, what are you talking about? It's fine. I have a job. Meanwhile, like one third of the population is like running through their savings and no real way to do anything about it. Um, so I honestly think that that's what the government is for. It's to step in and deal with situations like that. The same way, like when a pandemic happens, they step in and say, here's money for the small businesses. Here's what we're going to do to try to minimize the harm for society as a whole, right? If you have like a third of your society that doesn't have a job, you're either going to have a revolution or the government's going to step in to make life at least like acceptable for that segment of society. Um, so at least in Canada, I think it would be quite likely that, short-term support would be approved. And then some people get like, a few checks or whatever is necessary. And then maybe you get one more round of short-term support. And then after that, you start going, okay, how are we going to reorganize the economy to actually support this? Because this isn't problem isn't going away. In fact, it's getting worse because more people are losing their jobs, more people are finding it hard to remain employed. Um, and I think that probably wealthier countries, and Canada's up there, but really wealthy countries like, uh, Saudi Arabia or Norway or Singapore or whatever, I think really wealthy countries would be the first to try experimenting because they actually have the means to do it, right? Um, they can basically say, okay, guys, we're going to like completely transform our economic system. We're going to take a little while to see how it's going to work, and we're going to pay everybody in the meantime. Other countries are probably going to be kind of scrabbling, right? Just taking a little more debt to give people a little more money, taking a little more debt, give people a little more money. Um, but once you have a couple of success cases like Singapore or Norway successfully transitioning into some other structure of economics, I think the rest of the world would follow suit very quickly. Like right now, we exist within a system which is the government sets up rules for us and laws, regulations. Many of us exist within a smaller system, which is working at a job, a company, for example. You have certain rules you have to abide by. They have certain rights on your time or rights to demand your time. And this would just be like another system that's even larger that exists outside of that, which, to be honest, would be extremely useful. Like right now, how does one country prevent another country from doing something? For example, Korea gets tons of pollution coming over from China, right? They harp on about it. They hate it. It's about one third of their pollution, according to best estimates. So what can they do to China? Nothing really. They can go to like the UN and say, we need better air quality. And China's like, yeah, sorry, our economy's doing well. Right?
Yeah,
There's not much that they can really do. But if you have a system outside of that that can really say, guys, we're actually in charge here and we're going to like uh, uh, broker this agreement. We're going to make sure that basically be the judge for this, right? Like what should actually be done is that if one party is being injured over another here. And I'm not saying it would look exactly like that because I think that ASI, for example, would be more closely involved in all aspects of life, like how the government works and how your job works and how your life works, right? But at the biggest scale, that's kind of what that is. Is it's a an outer shell around civilization that is kind of a more ultimate authority that you probably don't think about too often, but does impact what you do a lot. Like the way the government says, you have to pay taxes or you have to drive on this side of the road or you have to like not injure other people in such and such a way that impacts your actions all the time. You behave more politely in public space because you know that like to do these types of actions is going to get you in societal trouble really quickly. Um, so yeah, that's how I think about it. You just would exist inside another system, and that system would interact with all the other systems in very interesting ways. Like company tries to do something, the ASI says, "Don't do that. You're destroying the planet." Right? Like there'd be a lot of interesting interactions there.
Do you like the idea of something like a large language model voting on your behalf? Because right now, obviously, we have representatives because you and I couldn't sit there and like read every bill that comes through Congress. They're just large and they're convoluted, but an LLM could summarize those for us, maybe even know who we are and vote on behalf of its estimate of what we would do. Do you like kind of the democracy being taken by AI to represent the people in some way?
Democracy through stochastic representations of everybody. I
Kind
mean,
of, yeah, through estimates.
I think it's pretty reasonable. Um, I've always thought that our political system should be structured as follows, and I don't know enough political theory to know if this even has a name, but basically, You could have everybody answering to every question. And then when you get tired of it, you say, I delegate my votes to Dylan. Or in this category, I delegate my votes to Dylan. And you'd have a social network, kind of like X or Twitter, where people that are pretty well known are, speaking with authority on a particular subject. And that's what this would be essentially. And you could
And it's
delegate.
because other people gave their votes for climate change to somebody who's an expert in that
Exactly.
topic.
I care about climate change, but I'm not an expert in it. So I find someone that is an expert and I say, whatever you vote related to climate change, I just copy your vote. And then it's a very scalable system, right? You can have every single question that the government is concerned with propagating through that framework. And most people are just delegating. And when they find out that like their delegatee is not answering the way they want, they just switch their vote, right? And like on a social network, you say, don't follow this guy, follow this guy instead. And then
Oh,
it
yeah.
could evolve pretty quickly. I think the only reason we don't have something like that is that the ability to process that information and the ability to have these types of networks that are basically social networks has only really arisen recently. But if you think about it, it's the most reasonable way to have everybody see every question and not take 100% of your brain or 300% of your brain.
And then maybe the LLM on your system would just keep tabs on the person you delegated it to, and then could maybe recommend, like, by the way, I think they are starting to not vote the way they were before. You might want to consider switching your vote to these other three people or leaving it with him for this reason.
Yes, or even the elements like the nodes in the graph there could actually be LLMs. You could say, I don't really trust this person anymore. I'll just trust this LLM to vote on climate change for me because the LLM has been trained on all the scientific literature about climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So I think of LLMs and humans could both be kind of decision making agents, and you could have either only humans or maybe humans and AIs, I don't know, having a vote or a portion of a vote or whatever it is. Um, but yeah, the simplest thing seems to be humans have votes. They delegate their votes to humans or LLMs. And also, like you said, you have LLMs kind of monitoring the whole system, so you can get notified when your appointee for the economy is about to do a vote that you don't approve of.
Nice. Well, it feels like you figured out a way to fix the world. That'll be perfect. We'll have to name it now that you've come up with it. So
The only catch is you have to put me in charge of the world and trust me to implement it, right?
what are the other YouTube creators that you like to watch?
When I was first getting into YouTube, because believe it or not, I used to not really watch YouTube videos. I got all my info from text, and I just stayed away from YouTube. And but I was
Oh,
like, I really
gosh.
want to have a channel, so let
Blasphemy.
me start using YouTube. Um, so anyway, one of the first videos I watched there was this interview by Max Tegmark, or interview by Lex Friedman of Max Tegmark, and he talks about Life 3.0, his book, and kind of how we're creating a new form of life, and it's in many ways it's right to think about it that way. That was very inspiring. I mean, it's long. All the Lex Friedman podcasts are, but I do recommend checking it out.
Yeah, what are some of the other YouTubers that you've been learning from?
My absolute favorite is Anton Petrov. He produces a video a day, and they're like 20 minutes long about some scientific paper. So I don't know how he does it because he's reading papers originally in astrophysics, but now he does like biology, chemistry, etc. He reads a paper a day and then makes a video about it and injects all this humor and has all these references and everything. It's truly incredible.
Oh my
So
gosh, this guy's got 1.3 million subscribers. I've never heard of him.
yeah, and I think he's getting subscribers very quickly too because his content is really amazing. But definitely check him out.
Any authors that are like kind of piquing your curiosity right now, or that you have on the shelf to read in the future?
One of my favorite books about just science in general is the Richard Feynman books. His biographies, like Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman is the first one. Feynman had just an incredible life, going from like learning different languages and living in South America, and then discovering this and that, and meeting famous people, and he really kept his integrity about all of it, and of course involvement in the atomic bomb project and all that too. So it's a really fascinating thing, and it makes you really want to be a scientist. I think even someone who didn't really feel that way before, if they read that book, they will understand the glamour of being a scientist.
That's
Um,
awesome.
I really like that book.
You're not an author, right? Like you have your PhD and you're making YouTube videos, but have you written a book?
I haven't, unless you count my thesis.
Okay, yeah, no, I should count that. Yeah, thesis is a pretty hard one. Do you think you're going to be an author in the future? Or what does the
um,
5 year plan look like for Dr. Waku's YouTube channel and media career?
yeah, I don't know. I originally started my YouTube channel when I was doing another job and trying to figure out how to get into AI. And so I thought, oh, just reading about it, making videos about it, that'll increase my likelihood of finding a job. And now I have a job in AI safety. Um, and I'm just keeping up the channel because I would love for it to grow to the point where it could fully support me or fully support somebody, like my family or whatever. Um,
No, I hear you.
that would be really cool. I think one of my strengths is explaining things to people sort of in person or where they can see me and my hand gestures um, and I can see them as well. Actually, I found it hard to make YouTube videos at the beginning because I couldn't see whether my recipient was understanding what I was saying. I find it much easier if I can see somebody. Um,
Yeah,
but
totally
I think
agree.
I think that's my strongest medium. But writing is also pretty strong for me, and I think when you start getting to these more complex ideas, sometimes writing is the best way to communicate it. And that's also why I don't get too much of my YouTube content inspiration from YouTube. I mean, I might, but then I'll go and read text about the thing, right? Because that seems to be the best way that humans have to communicate really complex things. So I don't know what I would write about, but quite possibly I might write a book. Sounds fun.
That'd be good. Yeah, because I noticed, yeah, it doesn't seem like you usually catch like the new Apple news or the Elon Musk comments. You seem like you're kind of marching to your own drumbeat, which I really appreciate. It means you're getting kind of your thinking from different places. And do you think you'll go on tour or anything, or would you speak at conferences or?
Yeah, I would love to speak at conferences. I mean, um, for me, that's one of the best parts about being kind of adjacent to academia is that you get to travel a lot and you just have an excuse to talk to people. So if I had a book, I would absolutely do that. I would message a bunch of universities and then I'd say, I'm going to come give a talk at your campuses if you don't mind. Um, and yeah, that would be, especially if my target was university students or, kind of um, people that like to think deeply about things.
Well, there's plenty of them out there, and I hope they all find your YouTube channel, Dr. Waku. And thank you for your time and sharing all your thoughts with me.
Well, thank you very much, Dylan. I appreciate the outreach. For the audience who doesn't know, Dylan just hopped into my Discord channel. So even though I'm not on YouTube that much,
Yeah.
we were connected that way. And
Yeah, well, and I'll plug your Patreon too. But yeah, I subscribed to your Patreon, and then it gave me access to your Discord, and then yeah, you could answer a lot of great questions. I know you do. I think twice a month you get on a Zoom call with your Patreons and your Discord group and answer all sorts of stuff. You were explaining to me, but we were talking about fusion reactors and fission and all that kind of stuff. So it was really cool. That was a great convo.
yeah, I remember that. That was really fun too. Yeah, I try to do twice a month. Sometimes it's more like once a month, especially while I'm moving and stuff. But we do those conversations. And thank you for supporting me on my Patreon.
Yeah, no, number one
That's
subscriber, man. I love it. Yeah, hopefully you get both of them. Yeah, we both need more on Patreon, so that's great.
exactly.
Yeah, and you can. That'll be hopefully that's how we can make this work. So, all right. Well, thanks again for your time and good luck with your research. And hopefully we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. Cheers.
Okay, bye.